systemic and endemic nature of violence against women and girls grounded in pervasive misogyny. And while the Suzy Lamplugh Trust works to reduce the risk of violence and aggression in society for all individuals, ensuring that everyone can go about their lives free from the fear of psychological, emotional or physical harm from others, we are concerned that women are disproportionately affected by stalking and other criminal unwanted behaviours across public and private spheres. So as with other forms of gender-based violence, these harms violate and restrict women's human rights to freedom and equality and prevent their full participation across social, economic, political and cultural fields. And with reference to CEDAW Article 1 and following the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women General Recommendation number 35, we consider this to constitute substantive discrimination against women. So more specifically, looking at stalking, we define stalking as a pattern of repeated unwanted behaviour that causes fear, distress, and in some cases trauma, and a fear of physical violence often as well. And this is defined by 4 key elements. The first is that it's a fixated behaviour. The second is that it's obsessive, so it has that element of obsession about a particular individual, and quite key is that it's unwanted. Despite many victims saying that they don't want contact from their perpetrators, that continues, and it's repeated. It's that pattern of behaviour, and that can be summed up with the acronym 4 that we use quite often in our communications. So stalking is a pervasive and widespread crime. The Crime Survey for England and Wales estimates that there were about 1.5 million victims of stalking the year ending March 2020. And while anyone can become a victim of stalking, statistics show that it is a gendered crime and linked to other forms of gender-based violence such as femicides and domestic abuse. In the UK, around 1 in 5 women compared to 1 in 10 men will experience stalking in their lifetimes, with 977,000 women estimated to have been victims of stalking in comparison with 526,000 men in the year 2019 to 20 in England and Wales. And these patterns are seen on the National Stalking Helpline, which we also run, which constitutes around 82% of victims, female victims, and 79% of perpetrators being male. And also we always refer to a research into 358 cases of femicide by Jane Monckton Smith, who worked out that in 94% of the cases she looked at of femicides, there was stalking behaviour antecedent to that. So, and just as a point of interest, about 55% of stalking victims on the helpline are pursued by an ex-partner, with the remainder by an associate, such as a neighbour, a work colleague, friend of a friend, so not an ex-partner. So we are concerned that stalking victims are not always able to access adequate health support to manage the psychological trauma, which is just completely devastating and prevents them from rebuilding their lives. In a recent pilot study, of whom 94% were women, 91% reported suffering mental health problems following their experience of stalking, yet only 28% of respondents who'd accessed healthcare services felt their experience of asking support was positive. So we know it's under sort of diagnosed really by healthcare services. And the study also showed that 78% of respondents showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. However, only 24% had been assessed for those for that condition, or had had their trauma adequately recognised. So we know that stalking disproportionately affects women. We're concerned about the inadequate health support for victims, and we do believe this constitutes discrimination against women in healthcare, which is in violation of the articles that I previously mentioned. Our work on women's safety in taxis and private hire vehicles is also key. We have ongoing concerns about women's safety in taxis and private hire vehicles. The Department for Transport considers taxis and private hire vehicles to be a high-risk environment, and has estimated that around 623 sexual assaults by taxi or private hire vehicle drivers are reported in England every year. And we know that the vast majority of those are targeting women. Not only are women more likely to experience sexual assault than men, according to the CSEW, but women's safety in taxis is a further concern, given that they may be more likely to use these mediums of transport than men as a way of travelling safely. So the Department of Transport estimated that women make on average 12 taxi or private hire vehicle trips a year, which is more than that by men. So it's vital that women feel safe in all forms of transport, and that these safety issues are addressed, specifically in legislation, because the current guidance is inadequate. And we also have concerns about women's safety in the workplace. We do a lot of work with employers and employees around safety at work. We know that women may be at heightened risk from violence, aggression and harassment in the workplace, including threats as well as physical assault. According to the HSE findings from the 2018 to 19 crime survey for England and Wales show that 1.5% of women, in comparison to 1.2% of men, were victims of violence at work once or more during the previous year. And our own survey of retail sector workers, with 67% of respondents identifying as female, highlights that abuse at work may be gendered, because 66% of respondents had experienced violence and aggression, and among those who gave details about the kind of behaviour they'd experienced, 14% had experienced sexual harassment or unwanted attention at work. And 92% of all of those respondents were women, and 29% indicated that violent incidents in the workplace were motivated by gender, which was a prevalent factor for incidents relating to respondents' personal characteristics. So we are very concerned that gendered abuse at work constitutes a violation of women's right to protection of health and to safety in working conditions in equality with men, as outlined in CEDAW Article 11. And finally, with regard to public sexual harassment, we are deeply concerned about women's wider safety in the public space. Misogyny permeates public space, with women's freedom and safety in streets, parks, public transport and other public places restricted daily by the perpetual threat of violence and harassment. Such violent acts perpetrated against women in public spaces range from sexual assault and rape to endemic forms of everyday sexual harassment and unwanted behaviours, such as catcalling, lewd comments and non-consensual physical contact, the latter of which have often been invisible in wider public debates around violence against women and girls, and largely normalised by society. Yet, as highlighted by recent research by UN Women UK, a shocking 71% of women in the UK have experienced public sexual harassment, with this rising to 86% among 18 to 24-year-olds. We believe this spectrum of public gendered violence is rooted in deep-seated misogynistic attitudes which objectify and belittle women as inferior to men and deny women their equal right to public space.
Thank you for that.
Thus, a fuller integration of CEDAW may help to hold the government responsible for guaranteeing women's rights de facto as well as de jure, including sufficient funding for specialist stalking services, as well as training for statutory bodies, and thereby ensure the substantive realisation of women's freedoms and participation in all spheres of life in equality with men. Alongside CEDAW, we also urge the government to ratify and integrate the Istanbul Convention into UK law, and thereby recognise the crime of stalking as a gender-based crime. This would enable stalking victims to benefit from a new set of minimum standards introduced by the government in line with the Convention to protect and support women, prosecute perpetrators and prevent violence against women. The Convention also requires state parties to set up specialist support services for victims of any kind of violence covered by the Convention, including vital services for victims of stalking.